To put things in context, when medical alcohol was made legal with the Volstead Act in 1920, we saw a growth in organized crime, specifically people like Al Capone. And now we have a medical cannabis law, or amendment, I should say, in Colorado. How do you see that being different than what the Volstead Act did for the community in terms of violent crime?
Well, in many respects, it's not too different. I mean, I think there's a lot of parallels I've talked about between prohibition of alcohol and prohibition of marijuana. And when you look historically at how the culture, how our society dealt with trying to figure out what to do with alcohol, it's probably a roadmap to eventually where we should end up with marijuana. Because when you look at the eventual solution with alcohol, after lurching back and forth from complete prohibition and medical use and whatever, which eventually ended up with was a passage of a federal constitutional amendment that permits essentially states and local governments to have an enormous amount of control over the dispensation of alcohol, where it is right up to being able to even have dry cities and dry counties if you want.
Mm-hmm.
I think probably something like that is where we're headed eventually with marijuana. The reality of human nature is that whenever you have a activity that a large number of members of society want to engage in, like we call the activity here possessing marijuana, it's impossible to have a meaningful law enforcement effort against it. Law enforcement, criminal law only works when you're regulating things the vast majority of society thinks should be illegal. In other words, murder, sexual assault, burglary, property crimes. If you take a poll, 95% of the people will say, of course that should be against the law.
Mm-hmm.
But with possession of marijuana, you could take, there's a poll in Denver Post yesterday saying that it's 44-44. That roughly half of the Coloradans think it should be legalized.
Mm-hmm.
So you can never do a law enforcement approach. All you can do is some kind of land use zoning approach, permitting local control so that local communities don't feel that something's being foisted on them they're not comfortable with dealing with. That's what we eventually did with alcohol. I think eventually that's where we'll end up with marijuana.
Okay, so there's that language of legalization, if you will, in there.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I think at some point Colorado is going to have to decide, and I don't think we're there yet. I don't support complete legalization yet, but I think at some point Colorado is going to say, you know, we have this huge bureaucracy set up now through the Department of Health, which employs thousands of people engaged in what's essentially figuring out who in our society gets to possess small amounts of marijuana and for what purpose. I could see Colorado sometime in the future going, there's other things we could do with those resources.
Mm-hmm.
Let's simply legalize possession of small amounts of marijuana and put those people to work doing something else.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I like the economic view of that. Thank you. I'd like to address the SB 1284 and what it's done and what Matt Cook at the Department of Revenue is moving forward with. I look at the Amendment 20 in regards to the position of caregivers and how they were allowed to have essentially an unlimited number of patients. However, with 1284, it's now been limited to 5 patients. Now, there are a couple of effects from that. One of them being that now a lot of those patients who used to have caregivers are now left without caregivers. And a lot of people would say, well, they can go to dispensaries. It's easy for them to just drive down the street. Unfortunately, a lot of these people are terminally ill, they're immobilized, or they don't have the money to actually have a car to get somewhere. So what is your opinion based on the, and I'm just going to call this a suggestion of 1284 because I'm still gray, if you will, in understanding it. But what is your opinion on that 5-patient caregiver recommendation?
Let me say this, Jason. 1284 is going to be in litigation for a long time because trying to line it up with Amendment 20 in determining what's constitutional and what's not is not an easy task, not anything anybody can guess at. And of course, if I'm Attorney General, I'll be somewhat involved in that. So I'm going to shy away from giving a legal opinion. Not that I haven't given it enough thought to give you a legal opinion, frankly. But 1284 as a policy matter, I was pretty ambivalent about. It has some good parts, but it has a lot of parts I think that create some issues. The good parts are, I believe, maintaining local control. I think that actually helps the medical marijuana community, and because because it keeps it from being an issue that communities that maybe don't want dispensaries get in a position where they feel it's being foisted on them by the state. And I think it calms down the political discussion. I think that's exactly what's happened. And I think in the long run, most communities are going to permit medical marijuana dispensaries because they're going to want the tax revenue.
Right.
The other thing it did was it recognized the dispensary model, even though it calls them centers, that I always felt was implicit in Amendment 20, but it's now specifically recognized. I think those two things were a step forward. But a lot of the other things, I don't know that they really add that much. I mean, if you really look at it, we already had local control because individual cities and counties were making decisions about dispensaries long before 1284. And the legislators that talked to me, I said, why not just let that play out? See what happens, see how the case out of, I think it's Castle Rock, where there's a case on appeal.
Heckenkamp, yep.
Yeah, see how that all plays out, and then if you need to come in and do something legislatively, you can do it. I think 1284 was an attempt to balance some of the pressure from the law enforcement community with an effort to recognize the reality of dispensaries, and we ended up with some provisions that may not be all that workable and probably will need to be tweaked in the future if they're found to be constitutional, like the 5-patient